Have you ever made a decision in the heat of emotion, one so impulsive, so reckless, that it changed your life forever? Well, that's exactly what happened to a lonely millionaire who kissed a random woman just to make his ex jealous. But what happened the next day shocked him more than losing her ever did. The story of the lonely millionaire truly begins long before the moment he kissed a random woman. It begins in the quiet places of his life, the empty penthouse, the silent dinners, the late-night drives where the only sound was his own heartbeat echoing inside a chest that used to feel full. Success had never been the problem. Money had never been the obstacle. But the one thing he couldn't buy was the feeling of being understood by someone who cared for the man behind the fortune. His breakup had been messy, not because of betrayal or scandal, but because of something far less dramatic yet far more painful: emotional neglect, not from her, but from him. In the chase to be enough, he had forgotten to be present. In the quest to provide, he had forgotten to connect. And when his ex finally walked away, it wasn't with anger, it was with exhaustion. She had said, "I don't need your world, I just needed your heart." And that sentence replayed in his mind like a haunting melody he couldn't mute. He believed he was coping. He threw himself into business meetings, charity galas, investment conferences, places where people applauded his name but never saw his loneliness. And for a while, that applause was his escape. But applause is temporary, silence is permanent. And when the noise faded, he was left alone with the truth he tried so hard to ignore. Then came the night of the event. The night everything changed. He hadn't planned to see his ex there, but fate has a strange way of placing people exactly where their emotions are most fragile. When he walked into the glowing hall filled with chandeliers and polished marble floors, he felt surprisingly composed. He had rehearsed calmness. He had worn a tailored suit not to impress others but to convince himself he was fine. But that illusion shattered the moment he glimpsed her across the room. There she stood, his ex, looking radiant, laughing with her friends, her happiness effortless. And that sight hit him like a punch to the chest. It wasn't jealousy of who she was with. It was jealousy of who she had become without him. She looked lighter, freer, as if the weight she once carried had been lifted off her shoulders the moment she stepped away from his life. And instead of feeling regret, he felt something far more dangerous: the desperate need to prove he had moved on too. That emotional impulse didn't come from logic. It didn't come from confidence. It came from a deep, aching insecurity that whispered, "Show her you don't care." But insecurity dressed as confidence is still insecurity, and heartbreak disguised as pride is still heartbreak. He noticed a woman nearby, a stranger, someone who had merely brushed past him while turning toward the bar. He didn't even know her name. He didn't know her story. He only saw an opportunity. His chest tightened with a swirl of frustration, longing, and wounded ego. Every unresolved emotion inside him collided in a single, reckless second. His pride screamed louder than his sense, and when his ex turned in his direction, their eyes met, just for a fraction of a moment. But that fraction was enough to ignite every impulsive instinct he had been suppressing. Without thinking, without breathing, without considering the consequences, he reached for the stranger's arm, pulled her gently but urgently toward him, and kissed her. It wasn't a romantic kiss. It wasn't even a meaningful one. It was a kiss born out of chaos, out of a heart that didn't know what it wanted except to not feel inferior. It was emotional impulse at its worst, unfiltered, unplanned, and rooted in pain. The millionaire felt his pulse racing. His ex's expression shifted, shock first, then disbelief, and then something else he couldn't decode. The stranger stiffened in surprise, completely caught off guard by his impulsive action. People around them glanced over, whispers stirred, and the atmosphere shifted into something awkwardly electric. For a fleeting moment, he felt victorious, as if he had regained control. As if her seeing him with someone else had rewritten the narrative, making him seem untouchable, desired, or maybe even healed. But emotional impulses don't bring healing, they bring consequences. The moment the kiss broke, reality caught up with him. The woman he kissed stepped back, confusion painted across her face. She wasn't angry, at least not yet, but she was stunned and possibly offended by being pulled into a moment that wasn't hers. He opened his mouth to explain, but what could he possibly say? That she was a prop in his emotional drama, that he used her to soothe a bruise on his ego. He didn't even know how to justify his actions to himself, let alone to her. His ex looked away, but not in jealousy, not in regret, more in disappointment, a deeper, sharper expression that cut through him far more effectively than anger ever could. And at that exact instant, he realized something painful. His impulse hadn't made him look strong. It had made him look lost. The loneliness he tried so desperately to conceal had been exposed, not through tears or confessions, but through a single misguided kiss. And the stranger he involved was now standing before him, blinking, waiting, trying to understand what had just happened. And he had no answer. The moment the millionaire's lips touched the stranger's, the entire atmosphere of the room shifted, subtly at first, then unmistakably. A kiss can be many things, gentle, passionate, comforting, electric. But this one was none of those. It was tense, hurried, and fueled by a cocktail of emotions he hadn't processed. It wasn't affection. It was desperation wearing the mask of confidence. The stranger froze, shocked by the suddenness of it. Her drink trembled in her hand. Her breath hitched in her throat as she tried to understand what had just happened. She hadn't exchanged more than a passing glance with him before this moment. She certainly hadn't invited such intimacy. The millionaire felt her hesitation immediately, the way her body stiffened like a question mark bending under the weight of confusion. But by then, the kiss had already drawn the attention of half the event. Gala attendees, socialites, and business associates who recognized him began turning their heads. Whispered conversations hushed mid-sentence. Eyes darted toward them with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. This wasn't a place where impulsive displays of affection were normal. It was a place where reputations lived and died. A place where people analyzed every gesture, every expression, and there he was, one of the wealthiest, most well-known men in the room, kissing a woman he clearly didn't know. The stranger gently but firmly pulled back, her brows furrowed. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice sharp but controlled. She wasn't raising her voice, yet, but the tension was unmistakable. It ran through her words, through her posture, through the space between them. He opened his mouth to explain, but the words tangled in his throat, because what explanation could possibly make sense? That he saw his ex and panicked, that he acted without thinking, that he used her as an emotional shield in a moment of weakness. Nothing sounded reasonable, even in his own mind. The people around them weren't helping. A few had taken out phones, some pretending to check messages while clearly aiming their cameras. Others weren't as discreet. They openly watched, eyebrows lifted, mouths half, curved into smirks of judgment or intrigue. A scene was unfolding, and they were hungry for the spectacle. His ex, standing across the room, had seen everything. The millionaire's heart thudded painfully as he glanced away. She wasn't crying. She wasn't rushing out. She wasn't storming toward him demanding answers, in many ways that made it worse. Her expression held no jealousy, only quiet disappointment, the kind that made him feel smaller than he had ever felt in his life. That subtle lowering of her eyebrows, the tightening of her lips, it communicated more than anger ever could. It said, "I knew you were hurting, but I didn't think you would fall this far." And that unspoken judgment sliced through him deeper than he expected. Meanwhile, the stranger he had kissed was still processing what happened. She looked at him with a mixture of irritation and concern, like she wasn't sure whether to be offended or worried for him. She took a small step back, putting distance between them, her hand gripping her glass like she needed something solid to anchor herself. "Did you seriously just use me to, what, make someone jealous?" she asked in a low voice, her tone edged but controlled. She didn't want to create a bigger scene, but the scene was already happening without her help. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His silence said everything she needed to know. Her lips parted in disbelief, and she shook her head lightly. He could see it. The moment she realized she had been pulled into someone else's emotional storm without consent, and the weight of that realization made a flush of embarrassment creep up his neck, because it wasn't just a stupid mistake anymore, it was humiliation. Not just for him, but for her. People were watching her too. They didn't know the context. They didn't know she was innocent in all of this. All they saw was a woman unexpectedly entwined in a very public display that she had never agreed to. The lights from the chandeliers caught her features as she took a slow breath, trying to compose herself. She wasn't the type to make a dramatic scene. Instead, she did something far more dignified. She held her head high, straightened her posture, and looked him dead in the eyes. "Don't ever do that again," she said quietly, firmly, not loudly, not angrily, but with a kind of calm strength that made him feel the weight of his impulsiveness even more deeply. Then she stepped away, not hurriedly, but with controlled grace, leaving him isolated in the center of a room that suddenly felt too bright, too loud, too judgmental. The crowd slowly resumed their conversations, though the atmosphere still buzzed with leftover curiosity. Small clusters of people exchanged whispers. Some smiled knowingly, others shook their heads, and in every cluster he could feel it, the narrative being written about him, one he no longer controlled. His reputation had always been one of discipline, sophistication, composure. But now, for the first time, people saw something else. A man who had lost control. A man whose actions betrayed insecurity hidden beneath wealth. And the stranger, the woman he had impulsively dragged into his emotional chaos, had walked away, leaving him to face the consequences alone. The kiss was supposed to prove something. Instead, it exposed everything. The next morning arrived far too quickly for the millionaire. He barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he replayed the kiss, her startled expression, the whispers in the room, the look on his ex's face. Shame had a way of clinging to him like a second skin, and no amount of rationalizing could peel it off. He wasn't sure which part hurt the most, the reckless impulse, the public embarrassment, or the realization that he had dragged an innocent woman into the mess of his unresolved emotions. The weight of it pressed on him like a stone. He told himself he'd reach out, apologize, explain, but he didn't know her name, didn't know who she was. She had vanished into the crowd after the kiss, dissolving from his vision the same way his confidence had. But fate was not finished with him. Late that morning, he arrived at a business meeting, one he couldn't cancel without raising questions. It was a charity board meeting, held in the same building where many philanthropic organizations worked. He entered the lobby hoping no one would bring up last night's spectacle. He didn't expect to see her there. The stranger, the woman he had impulsively kissed, was standing at the reception desk, speaking to an assistant with a folder tucked under her arm. She wasn't dressed for a gala this time. She wore a simple blouse, a neat skirt, and an ID badge clipped to her side. Her hair was tied back. She looked professional, calm, and collected. Yet, when she turned and saw him, recognition flickered in her eyes like a match being struck. Not anger, not embarrassment, just controlled, quiet resolve. He froze. His first instinct was to retreat, to pretend he hadn't seen her, to escape the consequence of his own actions. But she turned fully toward him, squared her shoulders, and began walking in his direction. Her confidence was steady, not confrontational in volume, but unmistakable in intention. Every step she took toward him was a reminder that he couldn't hide from what he had done. She stopped a few feet in front of him, close enough to speak softly, but far enough to keep emotional distance. So, she began, her voice even and controlled. "Do you always kiss strangers, or was I just the lucky one last night?" The sarcasm wasn't sharp, it was measured, mature, and far more cutting because of how calm she was. He swallowed. No, I don't. I'm really sorry about that. I shouldn't have, you think." She cut in, lifting an eyebrow. "You pulled me into something I didn't agree to. You used me." There was no hostility in her tone. Just truth, raw and plain. The millionaire felt heat crawl up his neck. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't dramatic. She was simply stating the facts he had been avoiding. I know, he said quietly. I was stupid. It was impulsive. I saw my ex and, she interrupted again. So I was a prop. He flinched at the word. No, I mean yes, but not intentionally. I wasn't thinking clearly. That doesn't make it better. She replied, you embarrassed me. You embarrassed yourself. And you try to drag another woman into your heartbreak as if that somehow fixes anything. Her words were firm, but not cruel. She wasn't trying to punish him. She was trying to hold him accountable, something he hadn't experienced in a long time, at least not from someone who didn't want anything from him. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling shakily. You're right. I can't defend what I did. I'm sorry, truly. I didn't even know who you were. I didn't know you would be here today. Funny thing is, she said, crossing her arms lightly, I knew who you were. That startled him. You did. Everyone in that room knew who you were, she replied, which is exactly why I was so shocked. Men with your status usually care about how they look in public. You must have been really hurt to lose control like that. He lowered his gaze. Her perceptiveness cut deeper than her criticism. She continued, but being hurt doesn't give you the right to pull someone else into your emotional spiral. He nodded slowly. I know, and I don't know what else to say except that I regret it. For the first time, she softened. Just a little, not in forgiveness, but in understanding. I'm not here to hold it against you forever, she said. People make mistakes, bad ones, impulsive ones, emotional ones. But what matters is whether you learn from them. Her tone changed suddenly, not gentler, but more sincere. If you're going to use someone, she said, at least use your mistakes to become better, not worse. Those words hit him harder than the shame, harder than the whispers from last night, harder than the disappointment on his ex's face. Because for the first time, someone wasn't reacting to his wealth, or his status, or his mistakes. They were challenging him to grow. She stepped back, ready to leave. That's all I wanted to say, not to embarrass you, not to lecture you, just to make sure you understood the effect your actions had. He nodded. Thank you, he said quietly. Really? She gave a brief nod, then turned and walked away, not coldly, not angrily, but with dignity, with boundaries, with strength. And her calm confrontation left him standing alone in the lobby, realizing something uncomfortable. She wasn't the one who had been out of place last night. He was. After the confrontation in the lobby, the millionaire didn't go straight into his meeting. He couldn't. His mind was too loud, too tangled, too shaken. Instead, he walked into an empty conference room nearby, closed the door behind him, and stood in the stillness, trying to make sense of the weight pressing on his chest. He had been confronted before. Competitors, board members, even his ex at times. But this felt different. The stranger he kissed. The woman who had every right to strike him, insult him, or publicly shame him, had done none of those things. She had done something far more disarming. She had spoken truth without cruelty. And truth without cruelty has a way of slipping past every wall a person builds. He took a seat, elbows on the polished table, fingers pressed to his forehead. Her words echoed relentlessly. If you're going to use someone, at least use your mistakes to become better. He didn't know why that line stuck with him so intensely. Maybe because no one had spoken to him like that in years. Maybe because she didn't sugarcoat, didn't flatter, didn't try to impress him. In fact, she seemed utterly unimpressed by who he was, and that alone forced him to look at himself differently. For most of his life, people had tiptoed around his shortcomings, treating him delicately as if wealth made him fragile. Or worse, they ignored his flaws because his status blinded them. But she saw him clearly, or past the suit, past the net worth, past the curated reputation. He wasn't used to that kind of honesty. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling, letting the memories of the past few months swirl inside him like a storm finally coming to shore. His breakup had hurt him, but he hadn't allowed himself to feel that hurt properly. Instead, he hid behind his work, behind social events, behind the illusion that he was too successful to be wounded. But her words had cracked that illusion. He began asking himself questions he'd avoided for too long. Why did he panic when he saw his ex? Was it because he still loved her, or because she represented a part of him he never learned how to nurture? The part that needed connection, vulnerability, and presence, qualities he had neglected for so long. Why did he feel the need to prove something? Was it pride, ego, or was it a fear of seeming replaceable? Or worse, unlovable? Why did he choose a stranger to fill that emotional void? Because using a stranger was easier than facing the truth of his emptiness. Because pretending he had moved on was easier than admitting he was still broken. He closed his eyes and the scene replayed again. The kiss, the crowd's whispers, the stranger's stunned expression. The humiliation wasn't what tormented him the most. It was the realization that he wasn't the man he thought he was. Somewhere along the way, his heart had become weak, hidden behind a hardened exterior that looked strong but was painfully thin. Her confrontation had forced him to confront himself. He rubbed his temples, feeling the tension build. He didn't like what he saw inside, not because he was a horrible person, but because he was a wounded one, and he had let that wound bleed onto someone who didn't deserve it. Then he thought of her again, not his ex, but the stranger, the way she had spoken to him. Calm, clear, direct. She didn't pity him. She didn't judge him for being hurt. She judged him for what he did with that hurt. And that distinction mattered. His ex leaving him had felt like rejection. The stranger confronting him felt like accountability. Two very different forces, but both revealing the same truth. He had been living emotionally unavailable for a long time. He took a deep breath, feeling something tug inside him. A pull toward reflection he had never felt so strongly before. What if this moment, embarrassing as it was, had happened because he needed it? Because he needed someone to hold a mirror up to his behavior, forcing him to see the parts of himself he kept burying under success. He stood and looked at the glass wall of the conference room. His reflection stared back. Flawless suit, expensive watch, polished appearance. And tired eyes. Eyes that finally showed the loneliness he spent so long hiding. He pressed his palm against the glass, almost as if trying to reach through his own reflection and pull out the person he used to be. Hopeful, connected, genuine. Before life became a series of accomplishments instead of relationships. He whispered to himself, "What am I doing?" The room didn't answer, but the truth hummed in the silence. This wasn't about the kiss anymore. This wasn't even about his ex. This was about him, about the version of himself he had become, about the man he no longer wanted to be. He sank back into the chair, taking a long, steady breath. Something had shifted inside him. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but undeniably. The confrontation wasn't just about last night. It was about his entire emotional pattern. And for the first time, he wasn't running from the realization. He was sitting with it, feeling it, questioning it. And in that quiet room, alone but no longer hiding from himself, the millionaire began the slow, uncomfortable, necessary work of seeing his heart clearly for the first time in a long time. In the days that followed, the millionaire found himself in unfamiliar emotional territory. He had always been good at compartmentalizing, sorting his thoughts like files, locking away the ones he didn't want to deal with, pretending they didn't exist. But after the confrontation, those files refused to stay closed. Every quiet moment seemed to invite reflection. Every still hour echoed with questions he didn't want to answer. And every time he remembered the look in the stranger's eyes, the calm firmness, the disappointment, the clarity, he felt another layer of his emotional armor peel away. It was uncomfortable. It was messy. It was vulnerable. But for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't running from it. The truth was, vulnerability had always been a foreign idea to him. Growing up, he had learned to equate vulnerability with weakness. His success came from being sharp, controlled, composed. In the world he lived in full of deals, negotiations, reputations. There was little room for emotional transparency. Every show of vulnerability was a potential liability. So he mastered the art of being untouchable. But untouchable eventually became unreachable, even to the people who cared about him. His ex had tried to reach him again and again, but he mistook her pleas for emotional closeness as demands for reassurance. He responded with gestures rather than presence, gifts rather than understanding, promises rather than vulnerability. The confrontation with the stranger forced him to recognize something painful. He didn't know how to be open. He didn't know how to express hurt. He didn't know how to admit he needed connection. But the only way out of the emotional mess he had created was to step into the very thing he feared: honesty about his own brokenness. He started small. Instead of brushing off his emotions with the usual excuses, "I'm fine. It doesn't matter. I'm over it," he allowed himself to sit with them, to acknowledge them, to explore why he felt what he felt. He stopped pretending he wasn't lonely. He stopped pretending he wasn't hurt by the breakup. He stopped pretending that last night's impulsive kiss wasn't a symptom of a deeper issue. And the more honest he was with himself, the clearer things became. One afternoon, while sitting in his office with a cup of coffee he had barely touched, he found himself staring at his phone. He knew he needed to apologize properly. Not the rushed, awkward apology from the lobby, but a real one. One that came from introspection, not embarrassment. But he had no idea how to contact her. So he did something he hadn't done in years. He asked for help. He reached out to the event coordinator from the gala, explaining that he wanted to privately apologize to someone he had unintentionally involved in a personal matter. He expected the coordinator to refuse or ask intrusive questions, but she didn't. She agreed to pass along his request for a conversation, leaving the final decision to the woman herself. It was a small step, but it was a vulnerable one, and he felt that vulnerability like a tremor inside him. Waiting for a response was its own kind of torture. Every email notification made his pulse jump. Every vibration of his phone sent his thoughts spiraling. But days passed with no reply, and he forced himself to accept that she owed him nothing. Not time, not forgiveness, not a chance to explain. Oddly, the possibility of not receiving closure didn't shut him down the way it once would have. Instead, it made him more aware of how much he had relied on external validation. He was learning, slowly, that growth didn't come from someone else's approval. It came from holding himself accountable, and yet, fate had more lessons in store. Late one afternoon, as he was leaving the office, he found her standing by the elevators. She hadn't contacted him first. She hadn't sent a message. She had come in person. She looked composed, her posture strong yet relaxed, not hostile, not defensive. When she saw him, she offered a small, neutral nod, the kind of acknowledgement that said, "I'm here. Let's talk." He took a slow breath. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, genuinely. She studied him for a moment, as if evaluating whether he was truly ready for this conversation. Then she said, "I heard you wanted to talk. I figured it's better to let you say what you need to say in person." He nodded. "I owe you an apology," he began, not rehearsed this time, not polished, not just for what happened that night, but for the way it made you feel. "I acted out of hurt, out of ego, and out of emotion I didn't understand at the time. You didn't deserve to be put in that position." She listened, arms softly crossed, not closed off but attentive. He continued, "I've spent the last few days thinking about everything you said." He paused, swallowing. "You were right. I didn't just misuse your presence. I misused my pain. I let it control me, and I'm trying to understand why." Her expression shifted slightly, not pity, something closer to respect, tentative, cautious, but real. "That's good," she said. "Most people avoid looking at themselves like that." "I avoided it for years," he admitted. "But I don't want to anymore." There it was again, vulnerability, raw and honest. And for the first time, she looked at him not as the man who made a reckless mistake, but as someone who was genuinely trying to grow from it. The moment wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional in the loud sense, but it was real. and he could feel something inside him shift, subtly but permanently. He didn't just want to be forgiven, he wanted to be better. And vulnerability was finally becoming his starting point. Transformation rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with fireworks, dramatic music, or a sudden revelation. Sometimes it begins quietly, with a conversation by an elevator, with a moment of honesty, with a fragment of vulnerability cracking open a door that had been shut for years. For the millionaire, change didn't sweep in all at once. It began in subtle ways, small shifts that slowly wove themselves into his daily life. After apologizing sincerely, he found himself thinking about the woman more often than he expected. Not because he wanted to make amends repeatedly, and not because she had said anything particularly poetic or life-changing. It was because she had held him accountable without belittling him, because she had spoken truth without cruelty, because she had seen through the surface he showed the world, and because she had been the catalyst for a version of himself he never thought he could access. He didn't try to force a friendship with her. He didn't want his transformation to depend on her approval. But fate continued placing her on the edges of his path. They ran into each other a few more times in the building. Brief moments, polite nods, quiet hellos. But each interaction held a shift in energy. The initial awkwardness slowly faded, replaced with a mutual acknowledgement of something. Unfinished, not romantic, not defined. Just a subtle recognition that their lives had brushed together for a reason neither fully understood yet. One afternoon, they ended up leaving the building at the same time. She was carrying a stack of folders. He instinctively held the door for her. It was nothing extraordinary. Yet when their eyes met, she offered a small smile, genuine, warm, and far different from the guarded expression she'd worn before. "Thank you," she said simply. "Anytime," he replied, and it felt more meaningful than the word warranted. As they walked outside, she paused under the sunlight, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You seem different," she said finally. He blinked, not expecting her to say it so directly. "Different how?" "Calmer," she said after a moment of thought. "Less scattered, less desperate to prove something." He exhaled, a faint, rueful smile tugging at his lips. "I guess I've been thinking a lot lately. I can tell." There was no judgment in her tone, only observation. And something about the honesty of it made him want to admit more. "I didn't expect any of this," he said slowly. "Not the kiss, not the fallout, not the perspective you gave me." She glanced at him, eyes thoughtful. "Most people don't change from being scolded," she said. "They change from being understood, even if they don't like what they're being shown." He nodded, letting her words sink in. She was right. It wasn't her confrontation that changed him. It was the truth that confrontation illuminated. They fell into an easy silence as they walked down the sidewalk together. He noticed things he hadn't before. How she carried herself with quiet confidence. How she spoke with intention. How she didn't hide her thoughts behind politeness, the way so many people around him did. He was used to being surrounded by people who agreed with him, praised him, or tiptoed around him. Being around someone unafraid to challenge him was refreshing. Eventually, she stopped near the street corner. "This is my stop." He nodded. "Right." But neither moved for a moment. Finally, she spoke. "You know, most people in your position would have just shrugged everything off. They would have said it was just a kiss, or blamed alcohol, or pretended it never happened. I tried pretending." He admitted it only made things worse. She smiled, soft, almost approving. "That's what makes you different now. You didn't run from it." He swallowed, feeling the truth of that more deeply than she realized. He had run from his emotions for years. Now, for the first time, he wasn't sprinting away from them. He was facing them, one uncomfortable layer at a time. "I'm trying," he said. "I can see that." Something subtle passed between them. Not tension, not attraction, something far more meaningful, mutual respect, an unspoken recognition that both had impacted each other more than either expected. Over the next week, they crossed paths 2 or 3 more times, each encounter surprisingly natural. A shared elevator ride, a conversation about a charity project she was working on, A brief laugh over the building's notoriously slow coffee machine, none of it forced, none of it dramatic. Just two people gradually easing into familiarity. And each time, he realized something remarkable. She wasn't the woman he kissed that night. She wasn't the symbol of his emotional mistake. She wasn't the stranger he used to make his ex jealous. She had become the mirror he needed. The interruption his life had lacked. The catalyst he didn't know he was waiting for. But more importantly, she had become someone he genuinely wanted to know, not because she validated him, not because she soothed his wounds, not because she was impressed by his wealth, but because she saw him, really saw him, and that alone was transforming him in ways he couldn't yet put into words. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic breakthrough, no instant romantic spark, just a slow, quiet shift, an unexpected transformation that began with a mistake and continued with a woman who refused to let that mistake define him. And though he couldn't yet see where this strange, unplanned connection was leading, he knew it was leading somewhere, somewhere he had never allowed himself to go before, somewhere different, somewhere honest, somewhere new. And so, what began as a reckless heat of the moment decision slowly evolved into the greatest turning point of his life. He realized that money had built his world, but vulnerability rebuilt him. That single, impulsive kiss, meant only to provoke jealousy, ended up revealing the emptiest corners of his own soul. But more importantly, it led him towards someone who saw the man he could become, not the mask he had been hiding behind. Through her honesty, her strength, and her refusal to accept excuses, he learned that healing doesn't begin when someone forgives you. It begins when you forgive yourself enough to grow. He stopped running from his past, stopped performing for attention, and stopped living for the approval of the woman who had already walked away. Instead, he began choosing the path of sincerity, humility, and emotional courage. And in doing so, he finally tasted a kind of love that couldn't be bought, staged, or forced, a love that emerged naturally, slowly, and truthfully. The truth is, life rarely gives us perfect beginnings. Sometimes it gives us chaos, embarrassment, or a mistake so loud we can't ignore it. But wrapped inside those imperfect moments is the possibility of change, of becoming someone wiser, braver, and more honest than we were before. And this man, this once lonely millionaire, finally understood something he had spent years overlooking. The right person doesn't arrive when you're at your best. They arrive when you're ready to stop pretending. In the end, he discovered that genuine connection isn't about grand gestures or dramatic scenes. It's about showing up as your real, flawed, learning self. And the woman he once kissed for all the wrong reasons became the person who inspired him to start living for all the right ones. Because sometimes, life's most meaningful relationships don't arrive wrapped in perfection. Sometimes, they begin with a mistake that leads you home.